Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com, and this is anti-war news for Wednesday, September 14th, 2022. The first story at the top of antiwar.com today: Ukraine seeks longer range missiles from the US. So, this is according to a report from the Wall Street Journal. Ukraine has made major requests for new weapons that it wants from the US, including a longer range missile system, as it plans to launch more counteroffensives in 2023. So, according to a document that was presented to US lawmakers in Congress, among the weapons that Ukraine wants is the Army Tactical Missile System. And now, this is a surface to surface missile system that has a range of about 190 miles, which is significantly longer than any arms that Washington has provided Kiev up to this point. The US has previously denied requests from Ukraine to send this system over concerns that they could be used to target Russian territory. But Washington has demonstrated throughout the conflict its willingness to escalate support for Ukraine, despite the risks of provoking Moscow. They have ended up giving things to Ukraine that they originally said they wouldn't, including the HIMARS rocket systems, which the ones that they've been sending Ukraine have a range of about 50 miles, which is a lot less than the 190 miles that Ukraine wants. The HIMARS were given to Ukraine under the condition that they won't be used to hit targets inside Russia. Although that restriction does not apply to Crimea, because Russia has controlled Crimea since 2014, but the US and Ukraine don't recognize it as Russian territory. So the US has essentially given Ukraine the green light to use US provided weapons on Crimea. The document says that Ukraine is seeking a total of 29 types of weapon systems and ammunitions from the US for their offensive operations. And this includes tanks, drones, artillery systems, more ammunition for the HIMARS, and more Harpoon anti-ship missiles. So Ukraine's request comes after its successful counteroffensive in the northeastern Kharkiv region. Russian forces were outnumbered in the area and they withdrew pretty quickly. Ukraine gained a lot of territory within just 4 or 5 days. Russia didn't. It didn't seem like Russia put up much of a fight. They didn't have many troops in the area, but still, Ukraine, it was a big PR win that they got all this territory, and it's hurting Russia. We'll get more into how it's kind of affecting internal Russian politics. But the U.S. is preparing to send more aid to Ukraine. The White House said on Tuesday that it's going to announce a new weapons package in the coming days. I don't think we should expect to see this new longer range system that they want in this package. I think it's more for a little further down the line that they expect to receive this. But the message from the U.S. has been long-term support for Ukraine. Last week, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, he announced another arms package for Ukraine, and his message at the Ramstein Air Base in Germany, where he hosted this meeting of all these defense ministers from over 50 countries, his message was that we're going to support Ukraine for the long haul. He used that term long haul repeatedly throughout his speech. So that's the name of the game here. And the Biden administration is seeking another $13.7 billion in funding for the war in Ukraine, and a lot of that will go toward military aid and other things, economic support, and for the U.S. to offset some of the costs of its sanctions on Russia. Okay, so the next one here. Russia says no war mobilization on agenda despite Ukraine's Kharkiv gains. So the Kremlin said on Tuesday that despite Ukraine's gains in that region, there are no plans for a mobilization, which would involve a nationwide draft. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said right now it's not on the agenda when he was asked if the government was considering a full or partial mobilization. Russia has made, since the war started, since the current war started when they invaded on February 24th, Russia has made efforts to increase its military and increase its force sizes amid the fighting in Ukraine, but they haven't ordered a full mobilization. And Russian President Vladimir Putin has framed his invasion as a special military operation as opposed to a full-scale war. When Russia first launched the invasion, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, he mobilized for war, which involved declaring martial law, and he ordered male citizens between the ages of 18 and 60, it's a pretty big range, he barred them from leaving Ukraine. So a mandatory draft, and fighting age males could not leave the country, all the way up to 60 years old. But in the wake of Ukraine's Kharkiv gains, Putin is under pressure to escalate, and there are growing calls inside Russia for mobilization. A State Duma deputy from the United Russia Party, which is the ruling party, the pro Putin party, is calling for mobilization. And the following day, the leader of Russia's Communist Party also made a call for mobilization in what he described as a war against the US and NATO. So that's how they are viewing this war inside Russia, is a war against the US and NATO. Russia did signal a potential escalation in the war on Sunday when it launched strikes on Ukrainian electricity infrastructure, but so far there are no signs that there will be a mobilization. Putin's government has not said much about the gains in Kharkiv, the Ukrainian gains. In Russia's military, it said that it's now focused on the fighting in the Donbass, in the Donetsk Oblast, which it still needs to, it's trying to take more territory there. And that's what they're saying their focus is on now. So they've been pretty quiet about what exactly happened there at Kharkiv. So a lot of people are speculating things, but I won't do that here. All right. The next one, we just have an article. This is another example. This is from the South China Morning Post, just about the pressure that Putin appears to be under. A Russian council could be dissolved after calling for Putin's removal. So this is a group, a council of local Russian politicians in St. Petersburg that were saying Putin should be removed for his what they see as his failure in the war. So it's just interesting to see that there is this dissent. Apparent dissent seems to be happening inside Russia against Putin. And the next one here, this is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. Putin will meet with Modi and Xi this week in effort to boost Russia's ties with India and China. So India and China have become major buyers of Russian oil in the wake of the invasion and the U.S.-led Western sanctions campaign. And as a result, Russia's making more money now off selling oil than they were before the war. So it just really shows how everything has backfired as Europe is facing this energy crisis and prices have spiked in the U.S. But so Putin, he's going to meet Modi and Xi in Uzbekistan. So just an example of how Russia's, looking to build stronger ties with these countries. And Modi is interesting. India's role in all this is interesting because the U.S., they want to really use India as a counter to China. Modi's kind of playing both sides, and India participated in military exercises with China and Russia inside Russia recently. So it's just, he's not as pro-U.S. as they would like him to be in Washington, at least. All right, so the next one here, we're getting into Iran. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Tuesday said that it's unlikely an agreement will be reached with Iran to revive the JCPOA, at least in the near future, and he blamed the impasse on Iran. Blinken said, quote, "What we've seen over the last week or so in Iran's response to the proposal put forward by the European Union is clearly a step backward and makes prospects for an agreement in the near term, I would say, unlikely," end quote. He told this to reporters while he was in Mexico City for talks on trade. And Blinken accused Iran of being unwilling to reach an agreement and claimed that Tehran introduced extraneous issues. The U.S. made similar claims in a statement to a meeting of the International Atomic Energy Agency's Board of Governors. So the Board of Governors is the IAEA's kind of panel of member states that are signatories to that convention. So the U.S. told them kind of similar thing, accused Iran of being an unwilling partner. And, while the U.S. is putting all the blame on Iran, it's just important to note that the Biden administration has taken a very hardline approach to these negotiations in general by refusing to lift all Trump era sanctions. President Biden has expanded the Trump administration's so called maximum pressure campaign. But Blinken's comments appeared to confirm remarks made by a senior Israeli official on Monday, which I went over yesterday. This official said that the U.S. and the European JCPOA signatories conveyed that an agreement wasn't going to happen and that the talks were dead, pretty much. The official also said that the U.S. had toughened its stance in the negotiations with Iran as a result of the Israeli pressure. Now, that characterization was disputed by a State Department spokesperson, which is interesting because it looks like, you see what Blinken's saying that, oh, it's all on Iran. They introduced all these demands. We can't talk to them. And then you have Israel saying that because of their pressure, their recent pressure, because for a second there, it seemed like a deal was going to happen. And Israel really stepped up its pressure campaign on the U.S. And then you have Israel going around. This isn't the first time an Israeli official said it. They're going around saying that the U.S. has hardened its stance, has toughened its stance, as opposed to just saying that Iran's making too many demands. So it kind of goes against what Blinken was saying. And then the State Department said that that Israeli characterization wasn't right. Another thing interesting that the Israeli official said that I didn't see until today was that they successfully sidelined Robert Malley, who was President Biden's special envoy for Iran. They were just saying that, oh, he's not even in the picture now. Malley played a role in negotiating the JCPOA when the Obama administration signed it in 2015. But the State Department, they also disputed that assertion, saying that Malley is playing a major role in the negotiations. Now, the U.S. and Iran, they appear to be at odds over the number of sanctions that the U.S. is willing to lift on Iran. And there's guarantees. Iran wants guarantees for when the U.S. pulls out. If they sign the deal and then the U.S. pulls out again and reimposes sanctions, they need something to shield that, because there's a very good chance that would happen. And also the IAEA inquiry into uranium traces at undeclared Iranian nuclear sites. I've been going over this a lot. Those are the main issues. We don't know the exact details, though. So it's kind of tough it gets tough sometimes covering this when there's all these statements flying around and we don't really know exactly what the disagreement is over. But I just want to take a moment here and mention our great sponsor, How the West Brought War to Ukraine, a book by Benjamin Oblo that explains how the U.S. and NATO actions post-Cold War played a major role in the war that we're seeing today. And one thing, I just want to mention a little excerpt from the book here. Can't really see it with my lighting, but that they can't deny, they can't dispute, as though the mainstream media and people in charge in Washington right now want us to ignore kind of the history before February 24th. One thing they can't dispute is that foreign policy experts and officials and Americans, very esteemed people, had been warning that this would happen over the years. And this is a chapter in the book about that. And this discusses George Kennan, who is a very well-known American diplomat who devised the containment policy for the Soviet Union. And there's a quote in here from one of his interviews with Thomas Friedman after the U.S. started expanding NATO post-Cold War. He said, I think it is the beginning of a new Cold War. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely and it will affect their policies. I think it is a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. This expansion would make the founding fathers turn over in their graves. So I thought that was a good quote that I haven't seen before this book. I've seen Kennan, he's written on it, but I've never seen the quotes from that interview. But yeah, it's a great book. $10. The link's in the description. Go buy it and buy some copies for your friends and family too. Okay, back into the news here. We have more stuff on Iran. And this is related to what I was just talking about. There was a report from a UN rapporteur that was issued on Monday, and it detailed the impact of the economic embargo on Iran that has been imposed by sanctions from the U.S. and other Western powers. So this report came from Elena Duhan. She is a special rapporteur for the impact of unilateral coercive measures, which sanctions are unilateral and coercive. And she said that the sanctions impact nearly every aspect of life and called for them to be lifted. In her report, she said, lift these sanctions. So the US sanctions, and this is a very important point, they technically have exemptions for goods such as food and medicine, what they consider humanitarian goods. But Duhan, she said that the licenses, so the US Office of Foreign Assets Control, they're supposed to issue licenses for exemptions. For businesses, if they want to make a trade with Iran and its medicine, the US has to issue this exemption license. And she said that these licenses appeared to be ineffective and nearly non-existent. So this is really because history has shown us this, that US sanctions discourage international banks and companies from doing businesses with the countries altogether. And because of this, US sanctions still cause shortages of humanitarian goods despite these exemptions. Last year, a group of UN experts said that US sanctions were causing medicine shortages in Iran, and Iranians with rare diseases have been dying due to the lack of access to special medicines that they needed. For example, Al Jazeera reported that Iranians with a disease that causes blisters and wounds on their skin were dying because Iran could no longer import a special bandage that they needed after the US withdrew from the nuclear deal in 2018 by reimposing sanctions. So you really see how these sanctions are killing people because they can't access medicines and stuff that they used to be able to. And you see how cruel it is. And this is, as I've said before, this is a feature of sanctions. It's not a bug. This happens every time. They have to know it. So it must be intentional that they want to hurt the civilians of these countries that they target. Duhan, the UN rapporteur, she said that the delivery of medicine and medical goods to Iran was severely undermined by sanctions. She also noted that sanctions have caused more food insecurity in the country. And these warnings come again as the US and Iran, the negotiations between them seem to be falling apart. And the Biden administration has not only continued the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration, they've imposed more sanctions. So they've made this policy even worse. And it doesn't change the government. Again, Cuba is the example I always cite. You know, they've been under embargo since the 60s. Same government hasn't done anything to do that. And it actually makes the governments more kind of anti-US. If you look at Raisi, he's the current Iranian president. He's considered a hardliner. He was elected, after all this pressure campaign and after Rouhani, the former president, was really humiliated by the U.S. for signing this deal. And then the U.S. turns around and just pulls out of it and imposes sanctions. But the next one here, this is another Iran. Iranian officials blame sabotage for a oil well fire in Iran. So a fire broke out at an oil well in southwestern Iran on Tuesday, and Iranian officials said it was sabotage. The blaze occurred at a oil field in the southwestern Khuzestan province, which borders Iraq. And the head of an Iranian state-owned oil company said that the fire was set by unidentified people and that it was immediately brought under control. Now, Israel has a long history of launching covert attacks on energy infrastructure inside Iran, although Iran hasn't yet attributed blame for this specific incident. But it did come the day after the head of Mossad, Israel's spy agency, threatened more covert operations inside Iran. So a lot of times with this Iranian officials are saying was sabotage. So that's why I wanted to highlight it, because a lot of times when there are incidents inside Iran, even industrial accidents kind of get overblown because people think that they could be sabotaged. And it also does benefit kind of Israel's narrative because they want to project this power inside Iran. So if there's like a fire at a power plant, they'll kind of hint that they were responsible, even if we know they weren't. But in this case, Iran, they did call it sabotage, and it's near the border with Iraq, where Iran has said that people working for Mossad have entered Iran from Iraq. So it could potentially be Israel, but we don't know. We don't know now at this point. The next one here. So there's a major flare-up between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and at least 99 were killed in the fighting. So the heaviest fighting between Azerbaijan and Armenia since the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war erupted early Tuesday morning, leaving at least 99 dead. Armenia said that Azerbaijan started the violence by launching intensive artillery shelling against Armenian military positions. Azerbaijan claimed that it's shelling. So Azerbaijan is claiming that they were responding to what they called subversive acts on the border that included attacks on their military. Armenian President Nikol Pashinyan, he said that 49 Armenian soldiers were killed in the fighting, but he expects that total to rise. Azerbaijan said that 50 of its service members were killed in the flare-up. Russia said that it brokered a truce between the two sides, and that took effect on Tuesday in the middle of the day, I think. Yeah, and it appears that the fighting has stopped. Now, Russia is a treaty ally of Armenia under the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is an alliance that includes Moscow, Yerevan, which is Armenia, and 4 other post-Soviet states. Azerbaijan, they received strong backing from Turkey when it made sweeping gains in the 2020 war that was fought over Nagorno-Karabakh and the territory around it. So Nagorno-Karabakh is a ethnic Armenian enclave in what is considered the internationally recognized borders of Azerbaijan. It is a self-declared republic known as Artsakh. So before the 2020 war, Armenia controlled territory. If you're watching and you see this dark green that's highlighted, that's territory that Armenia controlled before the war, and Azerbaijan has been ceded to Azerbaijan after the fighting in 2020. It's about a month or 2 months long. The fighting, a few thousand people were killed. And this blue area is other territory that Azerbaijan has captured. And there's Russian peacekeepers deployed in the region as part of the ceasefire deal. So Nagorno-Karabakh, it was always considered a frozen conflict. There was a major war around the time that the Soviet Union collapsed. It's post former Soviet states, and there's, like in a lot of areas, territorial disputes. And the war in the early 1990s killed tens of thousands of people. And then a ceasefire was reached in 94. And the situation is considered a frozen conflict. And it still is, I think, because this ceasefire, Azerbaijan wants more territory. It seems like just because there is sections of Armenia that's in between some of its territory, and it just seems like this could really break out into another full-scale war at any time. And it's interesting, there's a lot of, it's not so black and white here. I know some people thinking that it was NATO, that egged on Azerbaijan to attack Armenia. And maybe if they did start it, maybe they took the opportunity of Russia kind of being distracted after that big counteroffensive in Kharkiv. That's definitely possible. But, the U.S., they kind of play it neutral when these two are fighting. If you look at numbers, they give Azerbaijan much more military aid, so they lean more towards Azerbaijan. But Armenia also gets a lot of support from the U.S. There's a lot of people in Congress like Armenia, and during the Nagorno-Karabakh war, which happened under the Trump administration, there was a lot of people in Congress, kind of urging Trump to do something to help them in some way. They weren't really calling for military intervention, I don't think, but then you have Azerbaijan is backed strongly by Turkey, which is a NATO member, but Turkey also does a lot of its own thing. Certainly what Turkey's doing is not what the collective NATO alliance necessarily wants to be happening. But during the war, when Azerbaijan was making these gains around Nagorno-Karabakh, Turkey was very much behind them. And but yeah, that's the situation. So 99 killed, ceasefire looks like it's holding for now. But again, there's always a chance of something really breaking out here. All right. So the last one here. The U.S. is considering sanctions on China to deter an attack on Taiwan. This is according to a report from Reuters that cited sources familiar with the plan. And they said that the U.S. is in discussions on a package of sanctions that they could put on China to deter Beijing from invading Taiwan. There's not really any details of what these sanctions could be in the report, and they said the discussions are in their early stages, but the sanctions would have to go beyond the ones that the U.S. has imposed on China in recent years. And the report also said that Taiwan has been lobbying the EU to take similar action. So it's not clear from the report if if the idea is that the U.S. would impose these sanctions before China attacked Taiwan, or if the threat of the sanctions package is meant to be a deterrent. If they're going to say, okay, these sanctions, hey, China, we're going to put them on you if you invade Taiwan, which would be a major change in U.S. policy, because right now the U.S. pursues a policy known as strategic ambiguity. They won't say one way or the other if they will intervene if China attacks Taiwan. And that means that they won't say if they'll put sanctions on China. They won't say if they'll respond at all. So if that became the policy, that would be a big change. And, this really, it's supposed to be a deterrent, but, something like this would probably just raise tensions and maybe give China more of a reason. It might make them think that they might have to take action. So this report, it comes as the sanctions imposed on Russia after the Ukraine invasion are largely backfiring on the West, as the US and Europe are facing high energy prices, and Moscow, like I said before, is profiting more from oil sales. And the US economy is much more intertwined with China than Russia, so any major sanctions against Beijing would likely hurt the US much more than the measures that are targeting Moscow. So that's something you have to keep in mind. I mean, if they really try to uh, put China under such heavy sanctions, I mean, it would just be a disaster as things stand right now. And the Reuters report said that the sanctions were being considered after China launched its largest ever military drills around Taiwan, which were in response to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visiting the island. Beijing made clear it would have that it would have that it was going to have a major response to Pelosi's visit, but she went anyway. It didn't stop her. And China has kept up the military pressure as U.S. officials continue to visit the island. Since Pelosi made her trip in August, 5 more U.S. delegations have traveled to Taipei. So this is still just a report, very early discussions. I don't know how this could be, how they could actually do something like this, but it just goes to show that the answer from the Biden administration right now is any situation seems to be more force. But that's it for the news for today. You can contact us, news@antiwar.com. You can support the show, antiwar.com/donate. You can also support the show by buying some merch. You can find that in the link down below to get one of these great t-shirts that I'm wearing. Really good, high quality stuff. And you get to, wear a shirt that says antiwar.com. And there's also other stuff on there. But that's it for today. I'll catch you guys tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.